Republic Day, Delhi. Indian troops celebrate independence from the British Crown by beating retreat. But the parade owes much more to British tradition than it does to Indian. 60 years ago, this was an army under British command. During the Second World War, 2.5 million troops from India, Pakistan, and the rest of the subcontinent formed the biggest volunteer army in the history of the world. It is an army that some Britons choose to ignore.
I can eat what I want, I can drink what I want, I can say what I want. It's a free country. That's why all our troops, died at Dunkirk. There's no package at Dunkirk, and Anzio, and Arnhem, and Monte Cassino.
Lots of black people died in those battles.
Not at Dunkirk, my friend. Oh, no.
The Commonwealth.
My brother was at all these places.
But the stained glass at Sandhurst tells a different story. During World War II, Indian troops fought across 3 continents under the Union Jack. They were at Dunkirk, they fought at Monte Cassino. They fought to save British democracy, even though under British rule they were denied it themselves.
फिर तो दिल खराब होता है, जैसे वो पाकी बोलते हैं। उस टाइम में माइंड में ये बात आती है कि हम इतना कुछ किया, अपनी जान कुर्बान की, जो अपनी लाइफ का सबसे अच्छा हिस्सा था वो इनके लिए दिया, और फिर अभी सलूक जो है वो ऐसा हो रहा है।
You can't really believe that we could have won the war without the Indian Army. Without the Indian Army, the Japanese would have overrun India. They'd have linked up with the Germans in Iran, and the whole world would have come under the domination of the Axis alliance.
After the war was won, most Britons forgot the Indian Army.
महसूस होता है हम अंग्रेज़ के वफादार थे, नौकर थे, ब्रिटिश एम्पायर के सर्वेंट थे, वो चले गए, बच्चा यतीम हो गया। अब जब उनके दूसरों के पल्ले पड़े थे, उनकी नई चीज़ आ गई, पुरानी चीज़ को जैसे रद्दी टोकरे में अच्छा पुराना कोट हो जाता है ना, नया फैशन आ जाता है, तो वो पुराने को फेंक दो, नया फैशन अडॉप्ट करो, वो चीज़ चल रही है।
It wasn't just the British who forgot them. The fact that so many Indians volunteered to fight for the British Empire became an embarrassment after independence. The whole subject is still sensitive. The Indian government refused Time Watch permission to film interviews in their country. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, the British Viceroy in Delhi told 350 million Indians they were at war too.
Their declared policy was that they were fighting for the freedom of the humanity. So we used to mock this news, that what false statement it is. Are we Indians not human beings? Our leaders, they are fighting for freedom since long, but they throw small crumbs to us and they do not talk of India's freedom.
Indian nationalists urged non-intervention, but thousands ignored them and flocked to recruiting stations.
लड़ाई लगा हुआ था तो लड़ाई में आदमी की जरूरत होती थी। हमारा सबका ये कर्तव्य बनता था कि हम फौज में जाएं और अपने मुल्क की हिफाजत करें। पहले भी हम अंग्रेज़ों के अधीन लड़ाई लड़ रहे थे और फिर सोचा कि अगर ये हार जाएंगे और दूसरे मुल्क के आदमी जो आ जाएंगे तो वो हमारे से अपरिचित हो गए। हम सदियों से पहले गुलाम थे और फिर आकर उनसे और नए तरीके से गुलाम हो जाते। तो हमारे ऊपर जो बंधन था ये पता नहीं कितने वर्षों से कदियों से ये चलता है। इस वास्ते हम चाहते थे कि वो दूर के दूर रहे, और जो हमारे पास जिनके पास अंडर हम है उनके पास रिक्वेस्ट करें या उनको हम काम करके बताएं, और ताकि हमको अपने राइट जो है, अपने आज़ादी जो है वो मिले।
जब हम रंगूठी पास कर लेते हैं तो उस वक्त एक कसम दिलाई जाती है कि जहाँ कहीं भी गवर्नमेंट भेजेगा मैं जाऊंगा, जो कुछ ये काम कहेगा वो काम करूंगा। तो हिंदुस्तान में ये रवाज है कि वचन ना जाए प्राण चले जाए।
हम जब निकले, मैं स्टेशन पर मेरी माँ मिलने के लिए आई। जब मैं जा रहा था तो मेरे वालिद साहब ने मुझे कहा, मैदान जंग से नहीं भागना, ये वो, ये देखो बेटा तुम ने अफसर बनना है, और गोली जो है ना पीठ में नहीं खानी, छाती में, ये एक जज्बा देना था।
Like all soldiers, Indian troops were expected to risk their lives, but received neither the same pay nor living conditions as their British counterparts.
पे में बहुत ज़्यादा फ़र्क था, रहने सहने के लिए बहुत ज़्यादा फ़र्क था। हमारी तो बारगाहों में पक्का फर्श भी नहीं हुआ करता था, हमें तो गोबर मिट्टी से रोज़ाना लीपना पड़ता था, और उनके लिए पंखे भी लगे होते थे, हर किस्म की सुविधा होती थी, हमारे लिए कुछ नहीं होता था।
The prejudice went to the top of the imperial government. Churchill did not disguise his dislike for Indians. When, in 1942, the Indian Congress Party failed to support the British war effort, Churchill retorted,
"I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion."
He considered Indians as inferior, and he considered Indians as corrupt people, unreliable. Besides, Churchill was an imperialist person. He had in his speech, we can forego, and we cannot, I have not become the first minister of Her Majesty's government to liquidate British Empire.
Churchill distrusted the loyalty of Indian soldiers and opposed a large Indian army. But the few Indian troops who were at Dunkirk in May 1940 impressed British officers with their discipline in the midst of a chaotic retreat.
Der Führer schreitet mit seinen Generälen die Front der Ehrenkompanie ab.
After France's collapse in June 1940, Britain's concern was national survival.
Die schnellste Jagdmaschine der Welt, sie stürzt sich auf den Briten.
What was left of the British armed forces after Dunkirk was needed to protect Britain from a possible Nazi invasion.
Da, der Engländer ist getroffen.
There were not enough British troops to spare to defend the empire.
In die Tiefe.
When Italy declared war on Britain and invaded Egypt in September 1940, Britain's vital oil interests in the Middle East were threatened. Lose the oil, and Britain risked losing the war.
In September 1940, Graziani invaded Egypt, but didn't get far.
Outnumbered 5-1, a largely Indian force of 20,000 men under the command of General Wavell defeated the Italians, bringing the British public news of the first land victories of the war.
We were providing them a bit of a boost because of the victory, and that was sadly needed at that time, following Dunkirk. It's not bad, you know, when you think that the Indians were fighting on a foreign soil for the empire's cause, not their own country's cause at all. Their performance was very good indeed, wasn't it? Their loyalty was very good indeed.
After routing the Italians in Egypt, Wavell's army went on to crush enemy armies in Ethiopia and Eritrea. In May 1941, the Duke of Aosta surrendered. By November, some 290,000 Italians and their colonial troops were prisoners of war. Dismayed at the Italian defeats, Hitler sent General Rommel with the Africa Corps to strengthen Italian morale.
वो एकदम सच्चे फौजी थे। जो कुछ वो ऐलान करते थे उस पर हमेशा सही टाइम पर हमला करते थे और उनका हमला ऐसा जबरदस्त होता था, क्या हवाई जहाज क्या टैंक, फटाफट चारों तरफ से घेरा।
वहाँ की लड़ाई थी कि हाथ के ऊपर हाथ मार के दौड़ जाओ। कभी वो 100 मील आगे आ गए, कभी हम 100 मील पीछे हट गए, क्योंकि वो रुकावट बहुत कम थी। इलाका बिल्कुल साफ था, जंगल वगैरह नहीं था। तो जब सोलम से तुबरुक से भागे तो सोलम में आके ठहरेंगे, सोलम से उनको भगा दिया तो वो तुबरुक से पीछे वो नहीं ठहरेंगे, इसलिए आगे पीछे ऐसे चलता था। इंडियन फोर्सेस एक एक रेजिमेंट 2-2, 3-3 दफ़ा, ये 36 सिख रेजिमेंट 3 दफ़ा सोलम में ख़त्म हो गई, 3 टाइम्स। बिल्कुल ऊपर चढ़ना पड़ता था, जर्मन ऊपर थे, वो ऐसा फायर करते थे कि रेजिमेंट की रेजिमेंट ख़त्म हो जाती थी, फिर नई रेज करते थे, फिर 2-3 दफ़ा वो रेजिमेंट गई है ऊपर।
By the end of 1941, India had sent 250,000 men to the Middle East. They were under the command of Indian Army General Claude Auchinleck.
जनरल ऑकिनलेक के लिए वैसे नेचुरली हर हिंदुस्तानी सिपाही का उसके साथ प्यार था, क्योंकि वो पुराना अफसर था, नॉर्थ वेस्ट फ्रंटियर में लड़ा, पश्तो जानता था, पंजाबी जानता था, गोरखा ज़बान जानता था, और वो फर्स्ट पंजाब का कर्नल रहा, लेकिन उसकी अपनी रेजिमेंट और अपने जवानों से ज़्यादा प्यार था और उसके लिए लोगों के दिल में बहुत इज्जत थी। अपने उसकी ज़बान में बात, उसकी जवानों की नब्ज़ जो थी ना, उसके हाथ में थी।
When in 1942 Rommel took the offensive, Auchinleck withdrew behind the El Alamein line, where he successfally checked Rommel's advance.
On this 40 miles front, General Auchinleck took personal command. The line held. After several days of attack and counterattack, the British were still there, fighting as dogged as our infantry at Waterloo. The immediate crisis was past, but anxiety remained.
But Churchill saw the withdrawal as a failure. He dismissed Auchinleck and replaced him with Montgomery, a general who did not endear himself to the Indian Army.
When he came and issued some stupid edicts, there will be no more withdrawal. It was absolutely ridiculous for a man to say that. We couldn't go back any farther, and we didn't intend going back any farther. We had a fortified or fairly good defensive position there, and there we intended to stay. He also issued an edict saying that headquarters and staff officers should take physical exercise in the morning. Silly man, we'd been running up and down the desert for a couple of years. It wasn't exercise we wanted. It was more resources.
But Montgomery had Churchill's backing and shared his disparaging view of Indian troops.
He used to make statements when he remarked all these things against Indians. How dare a commander say the Indian troops, he doesn't want Indian troops in this battle here, unless he had a backing of somebody.
Montgomery was given the resources he required to win the Second Battle of Alamein, including an Indian division.
That tremendous bombardment, the whole place was lit up. Nobody had seen at that time, heard. Tremendous bombardment at that time. Of Montgomery, he made it certain that all the equipment was available to him before he moved further. Whereas Wavell and Auchinleck were told to do with whatever they had with them and get on with it.
The Indian Army may have been poorly equipped in North Africa, but in the jungles of Malaya and Burma it was totally unprepared. When the Japanese invasion came in December 1941, of the force defending Britain's possessions in Singapore and Malaya, 2/3 were Indian, not British.
We never believed that we would be defeated. We had full faith in the victory of British government, and we did not mind retreating because it is a temporary, we considered it a temporary setback, and we were confident to win the war.
The जापानी हवाई जहाज़ आसमान की बुलंदी पर परवाज़ कर रहे थे तो हमारे एक अफसर से हमने पूछा डेक पर कि ये क्या, तो कहने लगे हमारे अमेरिकन दोस्त हैं, वो मदद के लिए आ रहे हैं। हकीकत में वो जापानी थे, हमें डार्क में रखा जाता था।
The speed of the Japanese advance trapped hundreds of Indian troops behind enemy lines. Some were put before firing squads.
वन बाय वन बैठाकर पीछे रस्सी से हाथ बांधे, वो 5 आदमी थे हम ऐसे खड़े थे बिल्कुल फायरिंग स्क्वाड के लिए। जब फायर हुआ तो मुझे ये पता है कि मैं गिर गया, मुझे और कोई पता नहीं। वो जो सिख साहब थे उनको मैंने हिलाया 2-3 बारी रात को 3 बजे, तो उसका खून मेरी वर्दी पर, मुझ पर, मैं लेटा हुआ था, सारा खून मेरे पर था। तो मैंने देखा कि मैं भी मर गया हूँ, लेकिन मैं कहता हूँ मरा नहीं। उनको हिलाया, कोई आवाज़ नहीं, सब मर गए थे। फिर मैंने अपने आप को निकाला, उधर से आ गया। 4 बजे टाइम, 5 बजे का टाइम था।
Raja was lucky. These pictures show the Japanese using Indian prisoners for target practice. Those who survived the ordeal were bayoneted to death. On the 15th of February 1942, General Percival surrendered the British garrison at Singapore. Of the 90,000 troops taken prisoner, 60,000 were Indians. They were separated from their British officers.
When British officers were separated from their soldiers, there was no guidance, no leadership, no senior officers. So we were left to our own fate.
The Japanese had been secretly in touch with militant Indian nationalists long before the Malay campaign. From amongst the Indian prisoners of war, they persuaded a Captain Mohan Singh to help them form another Indian army, this time to fight against the British. But to join the Indian National Army, or INA, he and other Indians had to break their oaths to the Crown.
Joined the INA in 1942.
Yes.
Weren't you breaking an oath of allegiance that you'd taken to the Indian Army?
That, madam, I do not agree it. What is oath of allegiance? Oath of allegiance was a forced one. It was not voluntary. It was forced on. Forced on what account? Economically, India was so poor at that time that to maintain our family, we had to join army. Yes, sir. What was the pay? What was the ration? What were the facilities? Nothing.
Initially, around 20,000 prisoners of war joined the INA. Its aim was to liberate India from British rule. Those who volunteered willingly to fight earned the contempt of many in the British Indian Army for doing so.
जो आदमी अपनी कसम पर कायम नहीं है ना, वो किसी भी टाइम धोखा दे सकता है। वो तो इसका मतलब वो मज़हब भी छोड़ गए, है ना। तो फिर जब मज़हब छोड़ दिया तो सब कुछ छोड़ दिया, फिर क्या रह गया।
The Japanese also found willing collaborators amongst the civilian population. Many Malay Indians also joined the INA. Even a women's regiment was formed. But to the chagrin of Mohan Singh, it remained an army under Japanese control.
You must remember that when we first formed the INA in 1942, Captain Mohan Singh, who became the commander-in-chief, fell out with the Japanese when they refused to acknowledge that the INA were equal partners and deserved equal treatment, and they were not going to take any kind of second-hand Allied treatment.
Fearing it was nothing but a puppet army, Singh tried to disband the INA. The Japanese arrested him and looked to another Indian leader. Chandra Bose, or Netaji as he was known, had escaped imprisonment by the British and fled to Berlin. There he raised a legion from Indian prisoners in German hands. But when he broached the prospect of liberating India, Hitler stalled. The Führer had always admired British rule in India.
Like Churchill, Hitler had also very poor opinion of Indian army. Hitler had also not. Both were of the chips of the same block.
Bose traveled to Tokyo and Singapore.
அவரோட கூடவே இருந்தனால அவர் வந்து எப்படி எங்களை வந்து நல்லா பயன்படுத்தினாருங்கிறதுனா நல்ல விதமான வகையில் அன்பா ஒரு தாய் பிள்ளைகளிடத்தில் எவ்வளவு அன்பா பழகினாரோ தகப்பனா அதே மாதிரி அதோட மேன்மையாக எங்களெல்லாம் ஆதரிச்சார். அதனால அவங்க மேலே எங்களுக்கு பூரண விசுவாசம். எத்தனை ஜென்மம் எடுத்தாலும் அதே தான் நாங்கள் வந்து அவரை தான் நாங்கள் மதிப்போம்.
When Netaji took over the leadership of INA, we really became patriot soldiers. Because the personality of Netaji was very grand. What was on his heart was on his tongue. He organized INA and he made us revolutionary soldiers. It was Netaji's personality who made steel out of clay.
तो उन्होंने कहा कि एक हिंदू लीडर आ रहा है, जापानियों ने पकड़ कर लाए हैं, तकरीर करेगा। हम मेरे कान में, जब मैं 2-3 दोस्त मेरे बैठे थे, हमारे कान में ये आवाज़ डाली गई। तो अगर ये कोई बात करे तो कानों में उंगलियां डाल लें, सुनना नहीं। तकरीर मैंने खूब सुनी, मैंने कान से वो निकाल दिया उंगली, मैंने सुनना शुरू किया। तो मैं गोल्डन चांस है कि मुल्क की आज़ादी, हर कौम अपने मुल्क के लिए लड़ती है और तुम अपने हथियार उठाओ, मादरे वतन के लिए लड़ो। उसने कहा कि ब्लड ब्लड ब्लड, तुम खून दो, हिंदुस्तान को तुम्हारे खून की ज़रूरत है। ये बड़े जोश से उसने कहा। और कुछ लोग मेरे साथ बैठे हुए थे, वो फड़फड़ा के उठ के उन्होंने जय वो का नारा वारा मारा, जाकर वॉलंटियर हो गए। पंजीता भी तो उसी वक्त हो गया।
आप ब्रिटिश के साथ क्यों लॉयल रहा?
मैं ब्रिटिश के, चूँकि मैं ज़ख्मी हुआ था, पहली बात मेरे दिल में और मेरे जहन में वो चीज़ आती थी, वो जो रात मेरे को लगी थी ना, तो मैं ये चाहता था कि जापानियों ने मेरे जहन में, जब अपना भाई भाई को मारे तो दुश्मन हो जाता है, वो तो बड़ी वर्ड की बात थी ना कि जापानी ज़ालिम मेरे साथ जुल्म हुआ था। दूसरा इसके लिए कि मैं मैदान जंग में दोबारा INA में भर्ती होकर कुत्ते की मौत नहीं मरना चाहता था बर्मा के रोड पर।
In Delhi, the surge of Indian nationalism caused alarm. Churchill made an offer of post-war independence for India in return for continued support in the war. General Auchinleck was appointed Commander-in-Chief in India, and he stepped up Indianization of the officer corps in the army.
Well, there was discrimination in the sense that there's very little chance of them going up through the ranks and becoming an officer. Some did, but very few. The Indian officers, when I joined, or when I came into it, were very much a rarity.
My regiment, they had purely British officers. There were no Indians in that before the war. It's only during the war that the Indian officers started going into the in the regiment.
Of course, that was extended a lot during the war until the Indian officer in an Indian unit was becoming quite common, and at times became the unit commander.
Indian troops were re-equipped and retrained for a new kind of war.
One of the features, of course, of the Jap was that he was very highly trained in jungle warfare. He made the most of cover of a tree trunk, for instance, all of which had to be taught to us and inculcated into us to use the jungle for cover. It was very, very vastly different. In fact, it was contrasted with what you did in the desert.
In this place, you could get into the bush and you were camouflaged. Infiltration was very easy. You could be sitting about 10 yards away and you could get behind the enemy. We were given training movements, how to move around carefully, how to fight the ambush. It took us about 3 months to reconvert ourselves.
In early 1944, 100,000 Japanese and 10,000 INA troops began moving up to the front line in Burma to attack India. The beginning, they hoped, of a victorious march to Delhi. Their first target was the last area where the British held territory in Burma, a thin coastal strip called the Arakan. There were now 2 Indian armies. But for every 1 Indian who fought with the Japanese, 62 remained loyal to the British. In the Arakan, they were so close they could shout to each other across the jungle.
वो बोलते थे कि हम भाई अपने हिंदुस्तान को आज़ाद कराने के लिए लड़ रहे हैं, आप लोग गुलाम हैं, आपको आज़ाद कराएंगे हम। तो हमने भी उनको ये बताया कि देखो भाई, बात एक ही है, हम भी लड़ रहे हैं कि ये दूसरे लोग जो है हमारे मुल्क में आकर ना आए, और आपका भी आज़ादी का मतलब है तो हमारा भी आज़ाद का मतलब और कोई बात नहीं है। लगता है लेकिन ना भाई भाई भी लड़ते हैं, माँ बाप भी लड़ते हैं, अपने अपने काम के लिए, अपने बड़े मतलब के लिए सभी आपस में लड़ते हैं। जीत किसका होता है ये जोर वाले का पता लगता है बाद में। तो यह है कि लड़ाई जो है हमको अपने आप से भी लड़ना पड़ता है, अपने आप से मन से भी लड़ना पड़ता है, अपने सिर से लड़ना पड़ता है, अपने घर से भी लड़ना पड़ता है, बच्चों से बात करना, सबसे जो है हमको लड़ाई तो करना ही पड़ता है जिंदगी।
The aim of the Japanese and INA was to encircle and overwhelm the British and Indian troops, forcing them to surrender. In February 1944, they surrounded the headquarters of the 7th Indian Division.
The Japanese attacked the admin box, and they overran the hospital there and killed most of the patients, most of whom were Indian, and took a delight, apparently, in doing so.
The response of the Indian army was a furious counterattack.
They got the Japanese into a valley, and they machine gunned them, and then they attacked them with bayonets. and because it was a pretty nasty, brutal thing.
The Battle of the Admin Box, as it became known, was the first time a British Indian force had successfully resisted Japanese encirclement. But in March 1944, the Japanese pressed the second phase of their attack, this time in India itself, at the border garrisons of Kohima and Imphal.
They attacked Kohima after going right the way across from the Irrawaddy up through the jungle to Kohima, and they were going on to Dimapur, which would open the road to India. Prepared, one wasn't, initially. But like in all situations, where it's adverse, you learn very quickly, or if you don't learn, you've had it.
The speed of the Japanese advance came as a surprise at Kohima. But now the Allies had control of the air, and so could reinforce their garrison, even though it was surrounded. The entire 7th and 5th Indian Divisions were flown from the Arakan to the Imphal area.
My division, 5 was airlifted to Imphal to help out, to fight the Japanese. And they started working towards Kohima to break that siege. But we had to fight all in areas, Japanese sitting on the high hills along the road from Imphal to Kohima.
It's scarcely strange that the camera never sees the enemy soldier until he's dead.
The Japanese had expected a short siege and ran out of supplies. In June 1944, the siege was broken. All that remained of Chandra Bose's dream of a victorious march to Delhi was a flag planted on the outskirts of Kohima before the INA beat a hasty retreat.
Some of them were very, very dejected. And some of them were told that if you don't want at this point to fight, leave. And they did leave, a few of them did leave. But on the whole, most of them said, our battle will continue. He who lives, lives to fight another battle, yet another day. So we had always had the strong conviction that Netaji would reconvene and reassess the position and move on again ahead with the battle. I can assure you that none of us believed that we were finished with the battle for the freedom of India. None of us.
For the British Indian Army, victory was now in sight, but only at a price. The INA were no longer serious opposition, but the Japanese fought for every inch of ground in Burma.
वो इस बात से कि जब भी हमने सुबह अटैक के लिए जाना था तो शाम के रात के टाइम पर हमको ऑर्डर दिए गए, हमारे कमांडर ने ऑर्डर दिए, ब्रिगेडियर उस्मान खान होता था एक, उसने हमको ऑर्डर दिए कि देखो जान वो सामने पहाड़ी है, उस पहाड़ी को लेना है या खत्म हो जाना है.
Fighting men of the great Indian regiments right up in the jungle front are probing into the positions held by the elusive and cunning Jap.
जापानियों ने एक पहाड़ी पर पोजीशन ले रखा, बैंकर पोजीशन था उनका, और उसके बीच में उन्होंने वो लगा रखा था मशीन गन, और हम अटैक करने के लिए हमारी कंपनी थी, और कंपनी के सबसे आगे जो था वो मैं था, मेरे साथ 2 जवान और थे. तो हम आगे बढ़ते गए, आगे से उन्होंने फायर किया, फायर करने से मेरे साथ वाले आदमी जो है मारे गए. मुझको बाएं हाथ में लगी और शोल्डर में लगी, कंधे में लग गई, और यूं ही वो लगी तो एकदम डाउन हो गए और कराल करते हुए फिर आगे बढ़ना मैंने शुरू किया.
Undeterred, severely wounded by bullets and grenade splinters and bespattered with blood, this sepoy, with superhuman courage and determination, crawled up to within 5 yards of his objective. He then threw a grenade into the position, killing the enemy gunner and 2 other men. It was only after the position had been taken that he lay down and allowed his wounds to be dressed. The King has been graciously pleased to approve the award of the Victoria Cross to Bandari Ram, 10th Baluch Regiment, Indian Army.
तो हम ईश्वर से ही प्रार्थना करते थे कि हमको ऐसा मौका नहीं मिले, हमको गोली लगे तो छाती में लगे, आगे वाले इसमें लगे, उससे हम चाहे मर जाएं चाहे बच जाएं, कोई फिक्र वाली बात नहीं, लेकिन कहीं ऐसा मौका नहीं मिले, ऐसा दिमाग में बात नहीं आए, ऐसे लड़ाई नहीं हमको लड़ना पड़े कि पीछे भागे।
जो ही सूरज छपा एकदम चारों तरफ से हमला हो गया, तो ये इनका जब तक कि इनके पास गोली बारूद रहा, इसमें मेरे 4 जवान मर चुके थे। उसके बाद में सुबह 4 बजे मेरा भी एमिनेशन खत्म हो गया और उनका भी हो गया। उन्होंने फिर चार्ज बोला। चार्ज का मतलब होता है कि राइफल के ऊपर ग्रेनेड चढ़ना है, सिंगिन चढ़ा करके, और सिंगिन से लड़ना। तो हमारे हिंदुस्तान में कहते हैं मरता क्या नहीं करता।
Calling once again on all who remained, he closed with the enemy in furious hand-to-hand fighting, and was seen to strike down 3 Japanese in a desperate effort to save his gun, until he was overwhelmed and knocked senseless. He was found in an exhausted state beside his gun, with 7 severe wounds and 10 dead Japanese around him. The King has been graciously pleased to approve the award of the Victoria Cross to Havildar Umrao Singh, Indian Artillery.
गन को छोड़ के ये एक ऐसी चीज है, जवान कोई भी हो, चाहे मैं हो चाहे और कोई हो, जो अपना हथियार छोड़ देता है वो उसकी मौत के बराबर होता है। अगर मैं गन छोड़ देता तो मेरा जिंदगी में कोई जीना नहीं था।
The Victoria Cross is the highest award for valour in the British Army. No less than 28 were won by the Indian Army during the Second World War. The youngest was Kamal Ram. He was just 21.
As youngest VC of the war, he's added further laurels to the magnificent record of India's fighting men.
Additional films on the capture of Mandalay. Thunderbolts and RAF Hurry bombers strike at Japs entrenched in the strongly fortified walls of Fort Duffer.
After the capture of Mandalay in March 1945, as they approached Rangoon, the Indian Army met the last fighting division of the INA.
We had a spirit that we are fighting for a cause, and we never felt that we have no good food and no, though we had inferior food and inferior clothing than British Indian Army, but in spite of that we were happy. Our slogan is last man, last bullet.
I would question it. I mean, I say some of them did fight heroically. There's no doubt about it. They believed they had a just cause. But nevertheless, as I say, the majority did not fight to the last man. We knew the INA were there, and we thought there were probably about 10,000 men, and we thought they would fight. But in fact, they didn't. They surrendered.
In May, the Indian Army captured Rangoon, and by August, Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The INA leader, Chandra Bose, fled Burma. He died in a plane crash on his way to Tokyo.
My whole emotions were moved. But when I met the British who came to interview us in Bangkok, because we were prisoners of war, and we were placed in the French convent in Bangkok, but we were taken out. We were treated very well. And when I faced them with the courage that I think my Netaji, our Netaji, would have been proud to see.
3 surviving leaders of the INA were tried for waging war against the king at the Red Fort in Delhi But to the surprise of the British, they were perceived not as traitors, but heroes in India.
The final summation and submission by Balubhai Desai was brilliant, in which he proved that these men could not be condemned for war against King and England or Britain, because they were patriots, they were liberators.
Captain Dillon, Prem Sehgal, and Shah Nawaz Khan were set free and became national heroes. Many who had kept their oaths to the British received a less warm reception.
बाहर जाएंगे मारे जाएं या किसी में इन्वॉल्व हो जाएं ये डरते थे हकीकत यह है वहाँ ये सुनने में आया था कि 3-4 अमेरिकन ट्रकों को ब्रिटिश आर्मी के ट्रकों को पब्लिक ने आग लगा दी है मारते हैं सोडा मारते हैं आँखों में मारते हैं लड़कियाँ मारते हैं लड़के मारते हैं पब्लिक का बहुत जोर है
அங்கே போயிருக்க சமயத்தில் எங்களுடைய சொந்தக்கார பசங்க அதில் இருந்து பிரிட்டிஷ் ஆர்மியில் சேர்ந்து அங்கே வந்து சண்டை போட்டிருக்காங்க ஆத்திரம் வந்து நான் என்ன செஞ்சேன்னு எனக்கே தெரியல கடைசியில் நான் என்ன பண்ணி எனக்கே தெரியல போத்தல் இருந்ததை எடுத்து அவன் மண்டையை உடச்சி நீங்கள் என்னோடையே வராது எங்களுக்கு எதிரியாக உள்ளவன் நீ இந்த நாட்டில் ஏன் இருக்கிற நீ போ நீ பிரிட்டிஷ் இங்கிலாந்து லண்டனுக்கே நீ போ அப்படின்னு நான் ஊருக்கு போகிற வரைக்கும் நீங்கள் வந்தீங்கன்னா உன்னை அருவா எடுத்து வெட்டி போடுவேன்.
Even in London, the welcome for the Indian Army veterans could be cold.
वो क्वीन को सलाम करते हैं ना गाना गाते हैं जैसे प्रे करते हैं उसके बाद फारिग होकर बैठे तो वो बैठा हुआ था लहदा तो मुझे कहने लगा कि यू सिंग आर इंडियन मैं कही यस आई एम इंडियन पंजाबी उसका कसूर नहीं उसको पता नहीं था तो उसने कहा कि दिस ब्रिटिश लीजन ओनली फॉर द ब्रिटिश मैं क्या व्हाट मीन्स फॉर द ब्रिटिश आई एम मेंबर ऑफ द ब्रिटिश लीजन आई पे फॉर द मैंने उसको बोला मैं पे करता हूँ बाकायदा कार्ड है और रिन्यू कराता हूँ कार्ड को एक्सपायर नहीं है दूसरी बात यह है कि ये अलाइंस फोर्सेस जो थी उसके मतलब पता उसमें क्या नहीं मैं क्या अलाइंस फोर्सेस में कॉमनवेल्थ फोर्सेस में हम बहुत सारे लोग थे जो किंग एंड कंट्री के लिए उसको किंग था.
In India, it is the INA of Chandra Bose whose veterans are fated as independence heroes and receive a freedom fighter's pension. Those who fought for the British do not.
लगता तो ऐसे ही है कि ठीक नहीं है उनका भी हमको तो और भी था ना हमें इग्नोर किया उनको पेंशन्स दे दी हैं लेकिन वो बोलते हैं वो तो फ्री जो थे फ्रीडम फाइटर थे ये पॉलिटिक्स है उनके.
We feel that we are also forgotten what we did during the World War II. The British have forgotten us, the Indian Army also forgotten us. I don't resent this, mind you. I don't resent this, but I feel for the other rank, a poor man who depends upon his pension, who depends upon the little award or the monetary allowance which is given to them. He's totally ignored. It's sad. It's sad that they are not recognized. Their deeds have not been recognized.